I'm Sarah Fenske, and this is the 314. Every episode, we sit down with St. Louisans who know what makes this place tick. Together, we explore why things are the way they are and how we can make them better. This episode of the 314 podcast is sponsored by Cardinals Nation. This summer, Peter Merideth moved out of the city of St. Louis. He'd grown up in the city. He'd represented his city neighborhood for 8 years in the state legislature. Yet he had come to believe that the suburb of Creve Coeur offered a better situation for his family because the school district there was better equipped to deal with his youngest daughter's special needs. It was a familiar story to me, and as someone rooting for the city, a depressing one. I know the city can't grow its population if it can't retain deeply committed families like the Merideths. And that's why I thought it was important to hear his story, even if it contained hard truths for us city boosters. As Peter and I discuss, there is a solution here, but it requires people in power to prioritize it. In just a moment, we'll hear from St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Krull with the latest news about St. Louis lawyers and the Trump administration. But first, one family's journey from the city to the county. Peter Merideth, welcome.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
So thanks for joining me for this. I know this is not an easy conversation. It's a personal conversation. It's also something that sort of gets into some of St. Louis's most fraught issues.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that you're willing to sit down and open up.
No,
about
I'm
this.
glad you wanted to talk about it. It's a hard one, though, for me.
It is a hard one. And so for you, you have 3 daughters.
Right.
The big catalyst for your move to the county was your youngest daughter, Finley.
Yeah, I mean, really not just catalyst. She was the reason.
Yeah.
We would not have moved. I never dreamed I would leave the city. I've lived there my whole life. I mean, it's a deep part of my identity, and I'm proud of it. And, you know, I spent much of my life with people telling me, oh, well, just wait, you'll have kids and then you'll move out. And I was offended by that. Finley changed things for us. Her needs made it where we just didn't feel like we had a choice. And once we started taking seriously the options of what we had in front of us, or if we moved, there was no comparison. And really, we made the decision fast once we got there.
So tell us a bit about Finley.
So Finley's an amazing little girl. You know, if anyone follows me on Facebook, they probably already know a lot about her because I like to put her story out there. She's an amazing kid. She's a teeny little thing, probably about half the size of what she should be for her age. In her little kindergarten class, she looks like she's the toddler walking around. But, you know, she has seizures. It's one of her big challenges. She's autistic. She's got significant developmental delays. She spent the first 2.5 years of her life on a feeding tube. So she's just behind, has lots of very unusual complications and no specific diagnosis that makes it easy to handle.
Okay, that's really hard.
Yeah, it is. And the seizures, you know, at school had been happening once every couple of weeks for a while. At one point, they were happening every week. And that's a really challenging thing for a school to deal with. And the more we encountered her autism and her difficulty learning also, we realized we really needed highly qualified, trained special education teachers and therapists working with her.
And so you had enrolled her in like the early childhood program through SLPS.
Yeah, so we had been in a preschool before that, like a neighborhood preschool that we loved, and had daycares that we'd tried. And it was really exciting to us when we discovered that she could go to SLPS for free in early childhood because of her special ed diagnosis. And honestly, it was a wonderful experience in most ways. She was there and she seemed to be thriving with lots of other kids. We liked the school. We loved the teachers. But as it evolved, we also kept encountering problems. And as we looked forward to after early childhood, it looked like those problems were going to get much more significant rather than less. And that's partly because it's no longer just for special ed kids that's free. It's for everybody. And yet it's sort of under-resourced for the population they serve, in my opinion. And so they just didn't look like they had a place that was going to be able to handle her. And frankly, we had to pull her out of SLPS a few months before she was even due to finish preschool.
So this was like early spring rather than late spring.
Yeah, because of problems we had with the school. Some pretty extreme problems that happened. And we decided we didn't feel safe keeping her there anymore. And again, we loved the teachers, but it wasn't going to work. And so once I had her home and I had termed out and needed to figure out a way that I can get back to work.
This is after your term in the state legislature wrapped up.
Exactly. I couldn't stay home forever with her. And if I couldn't send her to SLPS, we started to look at other options. We looked at private school options, and they, we're part of St. Margaret's. They were willing to bend over backwards, and it was exciting, and they were wonderful about it, trying to accommodate her. But the more we looked at it, they couldn't.
Yeah.
Not the way that a large school district with resources can, who's full of people that are trained for dealing with kids that don't fit the mold. And that's why we moved.
And you said this happened very rapidly.
So fast.
I know from the outside looking in, it was like, oh my goodness, the Merediths are moving. And then it was like, no, the Merediths have already moved. You just kind of like seized this.
We looked at one house.
I mean, you got very lucky then.
Well, we fell in love with the school
pretty
fast from talking to people. And we also realized that we needed to do it before, in time for her to register for school.
You didn't want to move her in the middle of a school year.
Exactly. Well, and we wanted her to be there to start kindergarten.
Yeah.
And that meant we had to move fast because it was the end of the previous school year. We wanted her to get in they brought us in for a pre-IEP meeting the last week of school. We didn't even live there yet.
And they were that accommodating.
To sit with us, with the principal, with 2 special ed teachers and a therapist, all sitting there just to meet her and get a sense of her needs before they would even need to craft an IEP, so they could get her started on the right foot when the school year started. We left that meeting in tears because we'd not experienced that level of understanding and eagerness to accommodate.
And this was the Parkway West?
Parkway North.
Parkway North. I get all my parkways confused. A big problem when you live in St. Louis and Parkway.
It was all the county to me.
Yeah. That's kind of how it feels. But this is really the special school district that supervises. And when you say IEP, this is sort of the individual plan for each kid that has special needs.
That's right.
So in the county, they have something they don't have in the city, which is this special school district that sort of is an umbrella over the whole thing.
Correct. Now, so for our experience with SLPS, when we first went in, for example, they didn't have a speech therapist at her school. Well, they're required to. They were required to give her speech services. Now, I wasn't blaming them because they're sitting there going, we keep having shortages. We're trying to hire, but of course they don't have an SSD. And so they're telling me a speech therapist can go to SSD and do the same job, possibly in an easier environment because they're better resourced generally, and make $20,000 more a year. Well, when we already don't have that many therapists, social workers, teachers across the board, it is especially hard if you're underpaying by $20,000 a year compared to down the street. And so they're always they seem understaffed. They're underwater. They're just trying to keep their heads above water and breathing. And so to expect more in-depth efforts and proactive measures is asking a lot of these teachers that are already overworked.
So if Finley had stayed at SLPS, it sounds like you had no confidence that they would be able to get a speech therapist there, these sort of special add-on things that would help her thrive, that just they weren't able to do
and not just having them. I think they would have had them. They find a way. But there weren't a lot of school options that would serve her. And adjusting as over the course of the year, there weren't as many options for like changing her from being 75% of the time in a special ed classroom, 25% of the time in a gen ed classroom, or maybe a month later, the teacher's going, actually, we think that we can adjust that. That's the kind of thing we found at SSD, that they were just like, yeah, this is what we do. And at SLPS, it was pretty obvious that if you're not forcing the issue, if you're not complaining, if you're not on them, they don't have the bandwidth to proactively address you.
Yeah.
And so they also then end up with even more families that are doing that, where they're having to be on top of them, getting mad at them. And then they feel like they're constantly under attack, and then they're even busier. And so it just feeds the problem. And it just seemed like all of those options that we looked at were tougher environments for Finley.
Yeah.
And especially such a vulnerable little kid. I didn't feel comfortable putting her in a space where I didn't feel she was completely safe.
So now she's in the county. She's been in school at Parkway North for a couple of months now.
Yeah.
How is it going?
I mean, it's been absolutely life-changing.
Really?
I can't quite express how when we doubt our move, which is frequent for me, all I have to do is take a minute to think about our first IEP meeting that we had a couple weeks ago, or even the fact that they called us in for a meeting 2 weeks before that to switch up her plan so that they could try a different approach and have 2 weeks of each to see as examples before her IEP meeting. And again, these are in the school day with like principal, with special ed teachers, with The team of 12 people that were in a room with us for an hour and a half for an IEP meeting just focused on Finley, and all of them with their own expertise and experience in their part of her equation. I mean, it was incredible. And she's thriving. She's doing great. She's happy. We're watching some explosions of growth happen for her. And when I look at that, I am absolutely positive that we did the right thing for her. I don't know if that's the right thing for everybody, because I wish that just every kid had that and it didn't depend on where you live. And it just pains me that I feel like even people like me leaving is kind of making that problem worse for the areas that don't have it. And I just wish we would fix the problems instead of keeping these incentives where people just have to move to get what they need.
I'm sure you saw this in all your years living in the city. Part of why I wanted to have you come in and talk about this, even though I know it's this painful subject, is that I've seen this with so many other families, that not just when kids get to be school age that they leave, but families where they might have 4 kids. If one kid has special needs, even if all the other kids have found a way to make it work in SLPS, that's the point when they go, okay, I'm sorry, we have to leave. We have to go to the county because this is what's best for this one kid. I'm sure you saw that.
A lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I heard that story too often. And it's one of the reasons that I actually, even in the legislature, started pushing really hard for SSD.
To bring the special school district to the
because
city
we
of
heard
St.
this all the time.
Louis.
And now, don't get me wrong, there are people that do find a way to make it work
Absolutely.
still. And I think that to some degree that depends on what your kids' needs are, depends on which schools are your options, and it depends on how on top of the school you're willing to be.
Yeah.
Some of the ones who I've seen do it the most effectively, it's because they also have the ability to really advocate for their kids and be on top of it and really make sure that they're getting what their kid needs at the school. That takes a lot, and that is itself a sacrifice. But what I kept seeing is people would see, but if I went to SSD, I don't have to fight nearly as much for that. Now, don't get me wrong, SSD is not perfect either, but it just has significantly more resources because there's an entire tax base paying for these special services. And St. Louis City just doesn't have that. And I kept saying as a legislator, why not? I filed a bill a couple times. Shamed Dogan, a Republican, filed the bill. Steve Roberts has filed the bill several times. And I went to the school board meetings and the administration repeatedly. Every year they'd come with their legislative priorities and I'd say, wait, why isn't SSD on here? Why isn't getting an SSD on here? Oh, well, we know it needs to be, but we're not sure what the details should look like yet. We haven't decided which approach is the best way to do it. So we're still working on that, but by next year, it'll be our priority. And year after year, it wasn't. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that's because they were also all trying to keep their heads above water.
Sure.
And dealing with the crisis of the day and dealing with the privatization pushes and vouchers and expansion of charters and all these things that are like an existential threat. So they're playing defense and they're just trying to deal with complaints as they happen. And again, proactive solutions for big picture changes like SSD, they just didn't have the bandwidth for it, it seemed like. But then what? Well, how do we fix it? Unless we go after those proactive things in a big policy way. And it just didn't seem like it was going to happen anytime soon.
My guest today is former State Representative Peter Merideth. We're talking about the big move that his family has made in recent months, going from the city that he lived in for years and loved to the county. We'll be back to that conversation in just a minute. First, a word from our sponsor. Cardinals Nation Restaurant and Bar is open year-round, and it's the perfect hangout spot in Ballpark Village. Their menu is a home run. Every dish is made to satisfy even the biggest league appetite. Check out their current menu and reserve your table today at cardinalsnation.com. And now back to our conversation, talking today with Peter Merideth about the very personal choice that his family had to make, but that also triggers some real serious policy questions.
Yeah.
So you wanted to do this in the state legislature. It sounds like there was some bipartisan interest.
Yeah.
Shamed Dogan, not there anymore, but was a good Republican.
Well, and I didn't really often find people opposed to the idea.
Yeah.
No one ever seemed opposed to the idea. But if the school district itself isn't saying, hey, we need to do this, and here's what our plan looks like for when we do it, it's really hard for anyone to move a bill like that forward.
So it really kind of needed the energy of the school district.
Yeah,
Okay.
or at least even of city leadership.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought this up. I was in this project where we talked to all the mayoral candidates, like, what are your goals for the city? And we wanted to bring to them what the people's goals for the city were.
Yeah.
A lot of people mentioned the special school district. All the mayoral candidates said, yes, we're behind this. We need to find a way to do this. When you were a state legislator, did you ever hear from anyone
No.
saying, let's move this forward?
No, because again, they were constantly dealing with direct attacks on like the earnings tax or things from the legislature where they're looking at something proactive through the legislature that's that big, especially, frankly, a tax increase.
Yeah.
I mean, anything that is a new tax that they're suggesting to the state legislature, a state legislature who seems to want to take money away from St. Louis City, not actually provide new revenue streams for St. Louis City. That seemed like an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And so it just never really made the conversation. Despite, I think, everyone privately going, yeah, I mean, that's pretty obvious that they need that the same way that St. Louis County needs it.
Yeah. There's so much talk about what is wrong with the city? Why are we losing population? I feel like a lot of people outside the city are like, well, easy, it's crime. But for those of us who live there, I think it's schools. And I think a lot of it is special
Well,
school
and frankly, I mean, schools and crime go together.
Sure.
Right? I've always said one of the biggest causes of one of the spikes in crime that happened was when we ended the after school programs. What was it called? The Community Education Center program in St. Louis. We had for a long time put money into making it so that our schools, our public schools in St. Louis, were also the center of their community for after school programs for all ages. I mean, they even had GED programs in the schools. They had after school sports. They had after school tutoring, all of these things. And at some point, I want to say in the late 2000s, maybe 2010-ish, they ended it because it was too expensive and they didn't have the resources to keep it going. Well, I would argue that is one of the biggest causes to an increase in crime is when all of a sudden, like in Shaw, for example, all these kids that used to go play basketball at night at the basketball courts, they weren't there anymore. They didn't have that option. The school buildings were shuttered. Lights were off. Everything was closed at the end of the day. So this giant building at the center of the neighborhood is dark when school's out. And so especially when half the kids in the community don't go to that school, they get bused to a different school or they go to a private school or they go to a charter school. We have devalued the role of the school in our communities. We've lost after school programs. When you do that, I think that leads to more kids looking for things to do when they're not in school. They don't have that base there in the middle and they get into trouble.
So we could pay on the front end for these after-school programs, and instead we cut that money, and then we end up paying more for police. We have to pay for prosecutors. Terrible to say, but we have to pay for jail.
Yeah. And the long-term costs in the community, we also pay for people leaving.
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, crime is one of the reasons people leave. There's no doubt about it. But I think schools are a bigger reason that people leave. People move so their kids can go to the school they want them to go to. And if you're not satisfied with the options there and it doesn't feel like there's one a part of your community, or maybe there is one, like where we lived, St. Margaret's felt like a neighborhood school.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
most of the
go.
families there can walk to school. And so it did feel like that, but only for a certain segment of the community. And that felt comfortable being at a Catholic school and part of a Catholic church and all of that. If you didn't feel comfortable in that environment, you didn't really have a neighborhood school right there. And so if you want a neighborhood school, you've got to go to a county public school or somewhere else. You want more resources for special ed, you've got to go to a county school. But then also, if you've got rising crime because you don't have schools centering the community, you might leave because of the crime too. All of this, I think, is something where if we could renew our focus on putting resources into the schools, even if it's not for the school itself, but to be a community center, that alone, I think, could do wonders for our city.
And you've spoken about the privilege you feel that your family was able to make this choice. I know there's some guilt that goes with that.
And I felt the same guilt about having two kids at Catholic school, just like I went to Catholic school my whole life. Because I do think that's part of the problem, right? That the people with resources to make the choice for their family that is best for their family, which I don't hold against anybody. That's human nature. Like we should do what's best for our families. But because public school is such a good that is a social good, that is a community good, the more the people with resources leave it, the more you're left with the people that don't have resources there, which means it's an even harder environment to teach in and it needs even more resources. So when we leave, we're taking our kids out of there, which are the most privileged kids. We're taking our money to some degree out of there, especially if we move. And we're leaving them with an even tougher environment and all these buildings they have to maintain, which they have to have enough schools for all of the kids in the city, whether they go to the schools or not. I mean, if one school closes, they have to be able to absorb it. It's their legal obligation, right?
Right.
So they have to maintain all of this, but yet they're losing the funding for it because they're funded per kid.
So
They're funded per student, not per kid. And I think that's a mistake too, because the schools are still there for all of our kids, not just the ones that are enrolled or, even worse, the ones that attend. That's one of the problems. We've always had attendance-based funding models
Right.
as opposed to enrollment. But I would go a step further and say it should be based on population. Because really it is their job to serve the entire community of kids. And if they had that funding, they could be doing those community things after school as well.
See, now when I hear you describe this, I'm like, yes, that would make sense. And yet, you know better than
Yeah.
anybody, trying to get any sort of even small change in the Missouri legislature is so hard.
Well, and again, because we're playing defense.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the push in the legislature, and especially among Republicans right now, is privatization of schools. They want to get rid of schools because it costs a lot of money and they don't want taxes to have to pay for schools. And they're like, every kid should get whatever their parents can afford. Well, that's not the world I believe in. And that's not what public schools have been for the history of America, right? I mean, for the last 100 years, public schools have been the heart of our educated workforce and strong civic engagement, all of these things. And when we devalue that and make it a Darwinistic, like you get with a capitalistic
Yeah.
system for schooling, you end up with an even bigger gap than we already have between the haves and have-nots. You also have, less accountability for the quality of schools. We talked about homeschooling at one point before we were on, and how there's no oversight for that.
Yeah.
Well, there's also not much oversight for most private schools. There's not much oversight. There's less oversight for charter schools than traditional public schools. There's also very little oversight for like the for-profit online schools that are coming in and trying to sell to people with voucher systems and whatnot. But every one of these steps is like an incremental step to just separating kids out of the public school system,
Yeah.
defunding the public school system, and then it suffers and is worse, and then feeds the narrative of, see, public schools don't work. Let's privatize it more. But really, we're just making the problem worse and worse and worse. And then the public school advocates are having to just try and stop the tide from continuing of defunding and destroying public education, rather than looking for how can we improve it? How can we create resources for teachers that aren't the lowest paid in the country? How can we create resources for after-school programs so that schools actually have sports again? And theater programs and music programs and all of these things that we know are important to the development of kids and communities that we don't have now. If they had the bandwidth to not just focus on playing defense and really going after some of those things, I think we could see powerful changes.
So I love this vision, and I feel like this would lift the city in a way that the impact that would have seems extraordinary. As we're looking at, wrapping this conversation up here, I want to also think about, okay, what could be done? And I
Yeah.
feel like Mike Kehoe, I don't think he would agree with most of what you just said, but I do think,
I don't honestly know.
yeah,
I think there was a time he might have agreed with a lot of it.
I think that's possible.
I think right now
Yeah.
we see more he'll just agree with whatever Trump says. And that's a weird world we're in right now that makes it harder to predict, and it's really scary, to be honest.
Yeah. That's a good dose of reality here
Yeah,
for me. You're right about that. But I don't want to give up on this idea.
No, it again goes to the bandwidth, right? With
Yes.
talking about important things like this is
Yeah.
hard because we're looking at existential threats
Right.
elsewhere. And it's like, well, where can we focus our attention right now? Well, we have to fight authoritarianism at the moment. We have to make sure St. Louis City has rights.
Yeah.
No, I mean, seriously, with state takeover of police, we've had a previous state takeover of the school board. Losing local control of things is an existential threat to our ability to manage our own rights.
Yeah.
And yet talking about a bigger change like that's proactive is really hard to do.
It's really hard.
And, we've also got the need to regionalize. It has been a real problem that St. Louis City is isolated from St. Louis County. And I do think that one way that we could take a small step, at least in that direction and addressing the schools, is if it was part of the same SSD.
to bring that special school district to the
Agreed.
city.
Agreed.
It's such a small step, but in terms of the whole Better Together vision, I'm like, this is one that could be done.
Yeah,
The
and-
logistics feel possible.
And equitably. Better Together had lots of problems with how it happened, but I think conceptually, most of us actually agree that more regional cooperation is necessary
Yeah.
for all of St. Louis to do better. And I think that that this is a fairly non-controversial one. The idea of we're just going to pool together all of our local property tax revenue in this additional property tax to fund special education for kids, and that all of our schools should have that, not just the ones in the county.
I want to mention just a number here. So the special school district in the county, people in a $100,000 home pay $183 annually, which, it's a decent tax. It would hit people.
Yeah,
in the
I'm not going to
city.
be excited to pay that.
Yeah, but you are paying it,
Yeah.
and it's been life-changing. I feel like
Yeah.
this, I don't know. I see an opening here if somebody wanted to run with this ball.
I can tell you, as a family that receives the services, $183 a year is absolutely nothing, and nothing compared to what we would have had to spend to get all of those services privately. But even as a community member, if I didn't have a kid that needed that, for me to spend that much money for that many kids in the community to get the resources they need, I am going to save far more than that in the long run from community impacts and quality of life from those kids having the resources they need. Because all of the other complicated problems that will happen 10, 20 years from now, because those kids were taken care of, you can't really put a price tag on that.
Peter Merideth, thank you for joining us today and
Pleasure.
opening up about this story.
Thanks for doing this.
Peter Merideth is the former state representative for the 80th District, which included his family's former home in Tower Grove East. He is now contemplating his next career move. Now, in just a minute, we'll hear from St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Krull for the closer. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode of the 314 podcast is supported by the 2026 Prevagen U.S. Figure Skating Championships. From January 7th through the 11th at Enterprise Center in St. Louis, see the stars of figure skating compete for a spot on the U.S. Olympic team. Witness current world champions like Ilya Malinin, Alyssa Liu, Madison Chalk, and Evan Bates compete for national titles as they set their sights on the Olympic Games. Tickets and more information are available at skatestlouis2026.com. And now for the closer. Last week, prosecutors were in court kicking off their case against New York's Attorney General. Letitia James faces charges of mortgage fraud and false statements to a financial institution. One of the two prosecutors bringing the case is the brand new U.S. Attorney for the Norfolk, Virginia District, someone who has no prosecutorial experience. The other is a prosecutor based in St. Louis. That makes for a highly unusual case. And joining me now to discuss it is St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Krull. Ryan, welcome.
Yeah, highly unusual is a good phrase for it, yes.
Yeah, so you kind of broke this story locally that the lead prosecutor on this case is someone that a lot of St. Louisans might be aware of or have connections to. His name is Roger Keller. Who is this guy?
Sure. So, as far as most people are concerned, he's the guy prosecuting the Letitia James case. He's at a relatively low profile here in St. Louis in the federal district that we're in. However, he's been a prosecutor with the office for a long time. I just checked. He was entering in cases as far back as 2003.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know if he was there for the full 22 years, but he's definitely got a long history with the office that's based out of St. Louis. But yeah, he was handling pretty much exclusively civil cases, especially I kind of did a deeper dive into his more recent work over the last year and a half, 2 years. And yeah, it was all civil stuff. He was like defending the post office for people who had sued the post office after a mailman hit their car, that kind of thing, defending some VA workers. So yeah, it is unusual that, this story is unusual in many ways, but it's unusual, yeah, that he would be brought in for this criminal prosecution on the other side of the country.
Yeah, so how did this come about that they're like, yeah, we're just going to bring in a guy from St. Louis?
That's a good question. So we have to kind of guess a little bit here. But the person who was the U.S. attorney for the Norfolk area of Virginia, it seems, according to the New York Times, basically refused to bring this case. So that person was given the boot by the president. He brings in his top aide, like you said, has no prosecutorial experience. And presumably they were looking for an actual assistant U.S. attorney to kind of handle the day-to-day,
to be the prosecutor.
Yeah, exactly. The actual rigmarole of all this. And how they landed on Roger Keller in Missouri is a little bit of a question mark. I'm really curious about that. I emailed him. I said, did you kind of put your hand up for this one? Did you get the proverbial tap on the shoulder? But I didn't hear back. But
You talked to some of his colleagues, former colleagues.
Yes.
One said, this is a guy who's wearing a MAGA hat, not when he's in the office.
Yeah.
But this guy is clearly a Trump supporter.
yeah, I think we could engage in a little bit of conjecture. Yes, he was a loud and proud conservative, big supporter of President Trump the first time around, and then the second time around as well. So it makes sense, I guess, that, yeah, he would sort of wind up involved in this.
And we should mention this is widely perceived as just a very political case, even beyond the career prosecutors saying they don't want to bring this. Trump has this history of tangling with Letitia James. She went after him hardcore between his presidencies.
Exactly. She filed a big civil lawsuit. Essentially, kind of the simple version is that she was accusing the Trump organization of inflating their assets. So yeah, Trump and some of his adult children were the subject of the prosecution. And yeah, they got hit with like a $460 million judgment, which is currently being appealed. And then James is now accused by federal prosecutors of robbing the government of about $18,000 for filling out some mortgage paperwork incorrectly.
So they were first in court last Friday.
Mhm.
This guy, Roger Keller, our local man,
Yeah.
he was there. How did that go?
It seems to have gone relatively smoothly. There was some blogs who I will say I think were who are coming at this with this whole case with a great degree of skepticism. So I don't think the folks who are largely reporting on this are inclined to give Roger the benefit of the doubt in any way. But everything seemed to go relatively smooth, although people did note that his sort of lack of criminal prosecution did seem to be showing a little bit. Like there was a sort of a polite disagreement over the amount of evidence that they felt like that the judge and the defense felt like the prosecution should have been able to hand over immediately. They said, well, you put this case together, surely you have some evidence you can basically hand over as discovery right now. And Keller was saying that, actually we're gonna have to wait a little bit, a few weeks to kind of get our act together here and hand that stuff over. He said that he expected the eventual trial, which is scheduled for January, to last, I think he said 10 days to 2 weeks, and they were going to call 8 to 10 witnesses. And the judge was just very sort of flummoxed by that. He said, this seems like a relatively straightforward thing. I don't know that we need
10 days.
Yeah, and then 10 people to testify. But then in Keller's defense, he said, well, back in Missouri, the way we do it is we let the judge know the maximum amount of time that this might take. And he said something like, our judges want us to do it that way. So there was a little bit of maybe a jurisdictional sort of culture clash there.
I got to ask you, did he say back in Missouri? Like
No,
he uses the outstate pronunciation?
No, that was just totally.
That's your editorial
That's my
flourish.
editorial. Yes, exactly. I mean, as a Missourian, I hope he does. Yeah.
So this isn't the first time that a lawyer in St. Louis's legal community has sort of come in to help Donald Trump with what he's up to. You kind of argue in your story at stlmag.com, this is a trend.
Yeah, no, sort of friends of mine who are more, amenable to the president, they're very proud of this, I guess, as they should be. Sort of they've referred to Missouri as kind of like the AAA or the farm club for Trump, the Trump White House. So yeah, if I leave anyone out, let me know. But obviously Andrew Bailey, former attorney general, is now the co-deputy director of the FBI. Will Scharf, who ran for attorney general, was like Roger Keller, an AUSA at one point. He's now the president's staff secretary, and oversees federal construction. It's got this sort of ever expanding portfolio, which I think is the curse of competence. A competent person just has more and more responsibilities added to their portfolio. D. John Sauer is now he was the Solicitor General for Missouri. Now he's just the Solicitor General for the country. He argues cases in front of the Supreme Court. Who am I forgetting? There's a few other. You got Mark McCloskey's obviously sort of in the mix and is somewhat sort of
representing some January Sixers. Yeah.
Ed Martin.
Oh, yes. Well-known Politico in St. Louis, and now was the acting U.S. attorney for a while.
DC, yeah. Now he's in doing something with the Justice Department, yes.
Yeah, so these Missouri guys kind of running amok in D.C., or as, people who are their supporters would say, Missouri's really making their mark.
Yeah.
So, well, I know you're going to stay on top of this case. It'll be interesting to see how our man does in Virginia. St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Krull, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Sarah.
I'm Sarah Fenske, and that's the 314 for today. You can find out more in our podcast show notes and at stlmag.com. You can also find me and Ryan every day in your inbox. That's thanks to St. Louis Magazine's fantastic free newsletter, St. Louis Daily. It's a fresh take on St. Louis with insight and original reporting, stories like the one we just discussed. You can only read them here. Sign up at stlmag.com/newsletters. The 314 is a production of St. Louis Magazine with audio editing by Brendan Shanahan. I'm Sarah Fenske, and this is the 314. See you next time.